Cool. Hey, so a quick intro. This session is going to be about coaching and mapping coaching and how we've been coaching for the last many years and how we applied mapping to coaching and what we've learned from that. This is the company that we both work for, Upekkha. So we care about meaningful founder outcomes. We've seen a lot of startups being built which have got great financial outcomes for the startup, but not necessarily good financial outcomes for the founders. And so that's what we're working on primarily for B2B SaaS. So about Tanuka and me, Tanuka heads content and program design at Upekkha. I'm a co-founder and CEO at Upekkha. Tanuka has been an entrepreneur herself and both been coached and been a coach. And actually, her previous startup, she was coaching other small business entrepreneurs who were running educational institutions as well. And I have done a couple of startups as well. And I've been in Amazon before and Microsoft before. At Upekkha, we work with about 70 startups in 8 cohorts so far, about 140 founders. Between the team, including Tanuka, we've run almost 35 cohorts of startup programs, and we've been deeply engaged with more than 2,000 founders in the last 10 years across about 8 or 10 of us who've been in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So we'll come to questions at the end. I'm going to stop sharing now. I think, Tanuka, do you want to get started right with the map? Great. So while Tanuka is getting started with sharing her, I wanted to kind of set the context for why coaching, right? And so all of us have been entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs are very stubborn and thick-headed. So we don't like to be told what to do. And many of us became entrepreneurs because we're not good at being employed either, right? So lots of cases of those kinds. Right.
Okay.
So, folks, we are mapping coaching here, and the anchor here is a founder who is to be coached, but really it could be coaching for almost anybody. But given our business is about founders, we primarily think about working with founders. So, Tanuka, over to you. I will uncomment out as you tell me to.
Yeah, sure. So at the start of the coaching process, when a founder first joins a program, they have some kind of a vague idea of what goals they want to achieve in their startup. And they decide these goals based on what they have interpreted as their context, which is a subset of the reality that they're immersed in. Which means that the reality here I am talking about their business vertical, the industry that they're playing in, the customers they're talking to, the organization they've built around them. So each of these is giving them some signals, which they filter based on their mental models, and they interpret that, and based on which they set some goals. So the first thing that a coach does is works with the founder to kind of reinterpret reality and evolve those goals to become better goals, smarter goals. So goals that are smart as in which is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So that's the first job that we do as a coach. Like, Prasanna, do you want to give some examples?
Sure. So lots of times, I think when we are getting coached, right, we may think that we want to accomplish a particular thing. And then when we go and start talking to somebody, we realize that, hey, you know what, this is not really what I want to be even attempting to do, right? And so the goal setting itself is something that a lot of us need help with from someone else, because we may have a very poor process for setting those goals for ourselves. So if I take an example, somebody's goal may be to grow their business, right? And so they come to a coach saying, hey, I want to grow my business. And then you work with them and you figure out, for example, that this person has a lot of trouble delegating. And so if they have a lot of trouble delegating, maybe they're able to hire people, but maybe they're not able to staff their organization in such a way that the organization grows along with their. So really the problem is then, hey, as a individual, how do you get better as a manager at delegating? So the goal should be, can you delegate better rather than grow your business? Because grow your business is great, but maybe that's not achievable without you figuring out how to delegate. So that's what, and grow your business in their context might be a very amorphous goal. They don't even know how to achieve it, versus delegation might be a much more achievable, realistic goal where we are precisely helping them define, in these kind of cases, you are not delegating well. and you need to get better at delegating. And we can then come back after a few days or a week or 10 days and say, hey, you were supposed to delegate these things. Did you delegate these things, right? So that's what we mean by helping founders transform their goals from something that's amorphous, not really achievable, not really, to something that's much more smart, achievable, trackable, and therefore something they actually go out and achieve.
So once we've set these goals, and then these goals, we say we will work with you to accomplish these goals over the next month or quarter, or we take it one step at a time. We have to now work, realize those goals, and that has different components and layers to it. The first is a mindset shift. And that's very important because each founder has a set of predispositions and a set of cognitive biases, like all of us. So one simple example could be confirmation bias. When they think that this is this great idea that I've come up with and I want to go and build this, it's very common to go and seek out prospects and customers or friends who will say, yes, this is a great product, this is a great thing. And even when they are telling you that, yeah, maybe the way, as the song goes, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. That's what happens. So cognitive bias is something that prevents you from seeing reality the way it is. So it takes a lot of working with them and feedback and other things to help them change basically shift their mind shift. The other thing is, of course, through this entire process, we have to give them emotional support. We talked about goals. One of the mistakes people make is that they shoot for something maybe that's very daunting, or then they feel that, oh, this is too big, too high a mountain to climb. And through both aspects of breaking down a big goal into something which is smaller and achievable, and giving them the emotional support through the entire journey, we're able to actually make them see progress, and that makes it much more tangible for them.
We put in, a inertia on the cognitive bias bit here, which you can see here, right? So can you folks see this inertia that's after the cognitive bias? So literally, the cognitive biases in your brain are a result of a genetic in your brains that some things should be understood a certain way. For example, the reason you are alive is because one of your ancestors probably looked at a brown bush that was shaking and thought that they saw stripes behind it and ran away quickly, right? Imagining that if there's a brown bush that's shaking and there are stripes behind it, there's probably a tiger behind it, and they ran away. And they ran away, and therefore they stayed alive long enough to be your ancestor. And so what happens essentially is, this is a cognitive bias that has inertia in literally in your genetically expressed brain pathways in your head, right? And so you're not going to be able to get over this inertia quickly. Another source of inertia may be that you have used certain practices, habits, which have helped you in the past. These practices have become habits, and those habits are unconsciously driven in your head. So things that got you here won't get you further, but those things that got you here may have made you very successful and have been very useful in your life. And these may be learned experiences, learned biases that exist. So between these genetically expressed biases and these learned biases, both of them cause inertia, which is very, very hard to get over for most people, right? So Tanuka, back to you.
Yes. So speaking of habits, that's another thing. Actually, why don't we talk about the feedback process first? So to move a founder's mind from one point to the other, a very important factor is feedback, and feedback can come from different places. One is, of course, the coach who is working with the founder. We also introduce a set of frameworks that are fairly well defined. We use frameworks like effectuation. We have a mental model of a flywheel because these are SaaS founders that helps to explain the business that they're growing. And we've instituted a community of peers. As our community has grown, the way MapCamp is also a community, we've instituted a community of peers because hearing this feedback from somebody who has walked the path before is much, much more, it lands much better, and the founder internalizes that feedback much better. And the last thing that we're trying with now, and it's still something we're thinking about, is simulations. That's another way of giving them feedback on how they do. So, therefore, to reiterate, to reach there, they need a mindset shift, they need emotional support, they need to build habits, they need feedback, and they need to build habits. Do you want to talk about the feedback process a bit, Prasanna, before we get to habits?
Sure. So I just want to talk about this pipeline because people would not have seen this. Most people would not have seen this earlier, right? And so when we look at this pipeline, what's essentially happening is that there has to be some feedback to the founder for their mindset shift to happen. And that feedback can be from different sources, one at a time or many at a time. And so therefore we are putting it in our pipeline. And what we've understood is that there are lots of frameworks which founders can apply themselves to get this feedback. So they look at reality, they apply the framework, and then if they are mindful enough, they're able to see that the framework is suggesting something else, and then therefore they shift their mindset and make a change. But this is obviously incredibly difficult, right? Because most founders are running a business all the time, and trying to do it while you're running a business is like super hard, right? But the other way of getting feedback is by having a coach, by having someone external who can look at that interpreted context from a different lens and can provide a feedback in a way which is not so attached to the coach can do a better job. But when we look at the practice of frameworks versus the practice of coaching, frameworks are productized more, right? It's a good practice. You have a set of frameworks which you can apply. They are fairly well understood. You have documentation about them, and therefore you can pick them up and use them. Unfortunately, coaching is not standardized in the same way. It's very interpersonal, very dependent, a relationship, and lots of stuff around that. Coaching is an emerging practice. You don't know when you speak to a particular coach whether they're good or bad. The wide variance in the quality of coaches that are available in the ecosystem and so on and so forth, right? So that's why we have put coaching a little to the left in the same pipeline. Then when we look at peers, this is something that we've been working on in the Upekkha context. We are the coaches, and how do we scale our time and effort, and so we want to be more efficient. Peers can also be great coaches, but then peers may need frameworks to be coaches, and or peers may need to be upskilled to be coaches. So peer coaching works really well, but peer coaching is even less understood than coaching, right? And that's why it's even more to the left of coaching in the frameworks. And last, very recently, we came across a company in the US run by this lady called Leah DeMello, and she's built a fantastic set of simulations which partially help with coaching, and among other things, right? It's like a business coaching simulation. So, and then we recently came across an Indian company called Nol, which also has simulations for you to improve your coaching ability through stuff like, it's basically like a game. You play the game, you have multiple choices, you go through different iterations of it. And if you do well, you can see your points and your score go up, but it actually changes your behavior and your mindset from a coaching perspective, right? So that simulation provides instantaneous feedback, and it can become far more productized. But when we spoke to both these companies, the interesting thing was Leah DeMello has written about this publicly, saying that somehow when we build simulations, they work, but whenever we've helped others build simulations, it doesn't work, right? And same way with Nullscape, when we were speaking, it looks like creating simulations that work to create this mindset shift is right now magic, right? There are a few people who can make that magic, but most of us don't even know what the hell is going on in that space, right? And so that's why simulation is on the left. We have invested heavily in the past 5 years into coaching and frameworks. We are now shifting our investment into peers and simulation because we feel that these are things which have other advantages in terms of scale and in terms of effectiveness and efficiency. So we're going to put more of our investment into simulation and peers. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how to use a pipeline. Essentially, in Simon's language, a pipeline is something which is an OR operator. You can get feedback in one of these ways, any of these ways. And so that's a construct that I have not seen used in many people's maps. So I just wanted to elaborate on that. Dhanuka, back to you.
There are some questions, Prasanna. So one is from Manish, which says, why is emotional support in Genesis and not outsourced to an agency that can bring expertise in this area?
So the reason emotional support is in Genesis is because even in an outsourced kind of a context, emotional support is not easy to provide, right? Therapists are trained and they know how to provide it, but it's not easy. And in the context of founders, emotional support for founders is something that is just being figured out. We actually have partnered with an agency which does that to create a founder program, but it's like very hit or miss. It's not something that's figured out. We can't just do it for a lot of people, right? So hopefully that helps. Philippe's question is next. Wouldn't a bias be more at that commodity and cause inertia for new order thinking to emerge? I'm just putting bias in the cognitive bias. We put it in the novel space because biases are not, in my opinion, well understood. So we're just putting it in a place where it's not well understood. But actually, you're right, biases are like this thing. So maybe we're talking about slightly different things. And definitely that inertia on the biases is what prevents new order thinking from emerging, right? So maybe we can redo the map. Manish has another question. Can coach be an active stakeholder in the venture? How can coaches remain objective if they are invested in the venture? Yes, it's hard to remain objective when you are also attached. So there has to be some degree of separation between the coach and the venture, but there needs to be some alignment of interest as well, so that if the venture succeeds, the coach succeeds. This is complicated. We're not getting into that for the moment. Tanuka, back to you.
Yeah. So the third component that we have to work with is building habits, and there are lots of habits that founders need to build a successful company. Prasanna talked about delegation earlier. There is planning, and there is looking at their metrics. There's the habit of conversations, different skills that need to be built. So again, that's something where there is inertia because you already have, as a person, certain predefined habits, certain ways of doing things, and it takes a lot of feedback and it takes a lot of practice to make this move forward. The practice itself requires role play, for which we often use peers. We can do role play with coach as well. And for practice, we are also thinking about using simulations. So all of these things come together to help move the founder from point A to point B. So again, Prasanna, if you want to share some examples.
Yeah, absolutely right. So one of the challenges we see again with habits is that habits have an inertia, right? And so it's very difficult for founders to get over their habits and improve their habits and do better at them. Of course, there is a very strong incentive for founders to improve their habits, and that incentive is the business will do better if you change your habits, right? So that way, from a founder perspective, from a startup perspective, it's probably there is a positive as well to change the habits, as well as inertia in terms of not changing those habits. So there are both sides. Something that pulling those habits to change and something that's keeping those habits in place. I also want to come back to the feedback a bit, right? So feedback without context is not possible. So feedback depends heavily on context. And so one of the reasons why we are exploring simulations is because in the simulation, we are hoping to somehow build that context in and be able to provide a more contextually rich feedback to versus a peer or a coach. In many cases, you are dependent on the context being explained by the founder, right? So when the founder is explaining the context and you're coaching them, then it's again very hard to separate out that context and the founder, right? And what is the interpretation of the reality versus context and stuff like that, right? So that part is really hard. Okay. So, folks, if any of you want to step up to stage and ask some questions, or you want to share something, I can see Philippe coming in. I have added him. Yes. Hi, Philippe.
Hello.
How are you, and where are you in the world?
I'm in the UK. In the UK.
Awesome.
Couple of thoughts is, and I work and I coach quite a lot as well. It's breaking old habits and breaking the inertia at the system level in leadership and so on very hard. Couple of things I've done which are sometimes interesting. One is sense making. And if you follow Dave Snowden, you know that bringing narratives. You don't know the data. People tend to use the data to confirm what they already think. But when you bring narratives, and especially narrative at scale that you can navigate through, it's much harder to actually argue narratives. And it's something we don't do enough. And I think there's certainly in the future, I think, working with narratives, working with SenseMaker would be just a normal place of business to understand where everything is at, where people think, how things are shifting, and making sense of the overall sort of narrative, the outliers, and so on. So I think there's an awful lot to come from that, and very often, you can try and make your point, demonstrate by A plus B that it is, and it is about narratives actually completely shift the perspective. Absolutely. The other thing is, and again, taking some clues from Kinevin here, sometimes it's about shifting the context and introducing disruption. And sometimes, if really the things are very much paralyzed, is about creating a seismic disruption into the system, so the system will actually reposition or actually take notice. And in systemic coaching, you talk about the 400-pound gorilla. If they don't want to move, it's not going to move. So, once we did something where we were losing a release anyway, and we stopped 250 people from working. So it's lost anyway. So you down tools, you reorganize, and we're going to safeguard that little bit of the release that is really important. And everybody else, you work out, you self-organize to working on something that's going to not fail a release again. And that created a disruption that people actually thought, ooh, quality actually matters. But that sort of things, at leadership level, creating disruption into the system, which is effectively a shallow dive in Kinevin terms, so the system can actually reorganize and you explore the dispositionality of system is very interesting. Thank you. A couple of thoughts for the box in the middle.
Yeah. Yes. I think if I had to paraphrase what you're saying, essentially there is a process of giving feedback, and that feedback depends on the context. In that, you may have to actually put in disruption. You may have to do something active in order to change that relationship between the feedback and the context and what people are seeing, in order to create that mindset shift. Is that
it's kind of outside the feedback process? It's just in the motion of change.
Sure.
And sometimes, people are like, oh yeah, we need to change, but nothing changed, nothing shifts.
Right.
And you need to create a big disruption that will shake everything, and it will land into another place, and that disruption starts creating the movement.
And we should think about how to represent this on the map.
So you engineer disruption, and you purposefully engineer chaos. That is what you call a shallow dive into chaotic, so where you engineer disruption.
Do you think that's easy to do, or is that something that's very tricky to do?
Very tricky.
Very tricky. So would you put that in Genesis or emerging? Is it something that if you do, you would get it right 5 times out of 10 or 2 times out of 10?
Yeah, probably bordered novel and emerging. It's actually to kind of cross a chasm when you kind of know where you want to go, but you need to scale it. It's equivalent to a crossing of the chasm, I think.
Right.
Where maybe a few people are able to do it, but you want that to be noticed by all before anybody can all do it. But at least you want them to pay attention, and that's kind of the first step of crossing the chasm, I think.
Yeah, so I've just put that there. Does that represent like where you would put it to achieve that mindset shift?
Yeah. Awesome. Maybe you can call it engineered disruption.
Yeah, I was just thinking it's an introduced thing. It's like active intervention.
And sometimes, you know what, you just exploit the disruption that is there, like with COVID. And understanding, those disruptions, what's the good elements of them? How can we amplify that? And work from there. So there's also exploiting existing landscape disruption.
Understood. So use that to that. Amazing. Thank you, Philippe. Manish, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think Philip mentioned about disruption, and that is in order to change the mindset. And sometimes it may backfire because some people crave for what I'm contributing, what are my positive aspects, and extend from there. And this disruption may backfire. So, as you said, the context is necessary. And I think if we want to call it as starters or whatever you want to call it, but this could be a pipeline where I have to give a feedback to my team member tomorrow, and he's not very open to feedback, right? And I have two
Right.
options. One, as Philip said, just start with the disruption. Hey, I think you'll be fired. I mean, and he'll say, oh, I'm all ears. Please tell me what I need to do. Or I would start with the strengths and say, these are some things you did well, right? And he gets an inspiration from the strengths. And being humble is one of the doctrine or principle, right? So if he's humble enough to recognize that, understand his strengths, and extend from there, then he'll be open to the feedback, saying, "Okay, what are my improvement areas now, which I can work upon?" Then that causes the shift in the mind. So yin and yang, whatever we call positive and negative forces, I think they need to be used deliberately and in the context. Maybe mix of it, like good cop, bad cop, but that's how the mindset should shift. And every individual is different, and so there cannot be a blanket process on how to start the conversation. One aspect is that, other is, as I said, principle. Being humble is one, and I believe the extension of the frameworks could be principles. And I think it's not explicitly mentioned, but somehow in the map there could be certain principles that would allow the coaching to be more effective. And I know,
Understood.
as far as I know, frameworks or mental models, because ultimate outcome of the frameworks are mental model, and
Right.
from there the principles arise. So some of
Right.
those
So I
things
think
could be
what you're speaking about may be slightly different, right? Coaching principles is what you're speaking about.
exactly, yeah,
Is
in
that
this context, of course, the principles. And ensuring that these principles don't become dogmas, as in where this is our principle. But if someone is not internalizing them as in universally useful for coaching, they will not be effective in that context. So I see principles as extension of coaching, so an outcome of it. So yeah.
awesome? Good.
Very interesting point that I was actually discussing with Chris earlier, very briefly by chat, and I'm going to look into probably next year. I don't know if you've seen, I wrote a Wardley CV and the story of the Wardley CV, and now I see that being useful for coaching. Now, and I'm keep that thinking evolving. And one thing that we learn in systemic coaching is you have three levels, and you have plenty of things, other coaching that includes those three levels. And the way actually Porsche did put it was you have the hands, the mind, or the head, and the heart.
Mhm.
And what I find really difficult sometimes is people are in the doing element, or sometimes they are in the
Right.
conceptual element, but struggling with it. But where they rarely step into the being element.
Mhm.
And the being element is how do you need to behave to be congruent with what you think? You know, how do you need to behave to have an impact on the system? But sometimes
Right.
it's how you need to actually embed that as a way of being, because
Mhm.
it's not about something, a face you can put or a mask you can wear. It's actually being like that.
Correct.
And being congruent, you know, being authentic, and you don't make that out. And that's where you actually coach. And as a coach, you know, as an ICF coach, it's very difficult to find people that are willing to step into at that level of agenda. They like to be at the doing. They like to kind of maybe touch on some framework, and already many will say, "Oh, Kinevin, that's way too conceptual for me. I'm not following anymore." But then to actually go deeper and reflect about themselves, how does
Mhm.
that make me feel? Why do I not trust that person? What does it take for me to trust my team? And that's not in the
Yeah.
doing. That's really deep down that.
Correct.
And I think on the map, we could look at representing those layers.
So do you want to tell me, and I'll give that a shot?
Well, it will be an element of visible. Visible is what you're going to act on.
Mhm.
And then there's the middle ground, which is the concepts you're going to get rationals from, and what you're going to make up, and what you're going to match to. And deeper down is what you need to be as an individual.
Okay. So do you
So
want to
where do you
like
need
kind
to
of tell
come
me
from?
what do you call these components? Are these practices? Is what is it?
Well, it could be hands, mind, or hands, head, and heart.
Hands, head, and heart. Okay.
It could be
So I'm
that.
gonna put
In systemic coaching, you call them the consensus reality. So that's what we make of reality. The middle ground is the dreams, and the deeper level is actually the sentient essence. But you could say the guts. You could say the mind, the intellectual level, and then you can say the hands, what you do on a day-to-day. So you can name those
Is this
things.
fair?
And it's
Is what
interesting how they connect in a value chain effectively.
Right. So if I see this, right, and then so a mindset shift has to change all that you do. In all these three, you need a shift. And
And
so
they're all connected. They're
how
all
how are they
connected.
connected?
The
How
thing
are
is
they
they're all
connected?
connected. And the question is, how far are you actually working? Because really the mindset shift is likely to be at the head level. But how far are you working with the heart? Because that's where the motivation is going to come from.
And motivation is interesting.
May I mean, I want to put my point of view here. It's very interesting going here. What I'm thinking of is heart, head, hands, all connected to interpreted context, right? And if you connect all these three to interpreted context, there is some interesting pattern of movement that I see here. And while hand signifies action, head signifies strategy, heart signifies alignment of purpose to that strategy, meaning that we believe that we are adding value to the society, right? That could be heart, that emotional connect. And so if we move this interpreted context forward, right, or shift that in some way, it will shift the mindset. Sometimes it only needs a
Hmm.
perspective to change the context, and that may drive the action, that may drive the purpose and the vision ahead. So
Mhm.
if most of the times maybe founders may not, and I'm not very into the brain of founders, but most of the time maybe the adamant nature of the founders, as Prasanna mentioned, could be because they couldn't move the interpreted context from novel to best. And by best, it doesn't mean industry best, but it may mean that the best that they can interpret as close to reality as possible,
I
because
like
we
that.
all have point of view and it may not even close to reality, but some point of view may be closer to reality than other, considering the aspect. So I think that is what I noticed on this map.
Very interesting point. Very interesting point. And I think, where you can even take it is you have to question whether the mindset shift is a direct line to head and heart, or whether it has to go through the interpreted context. Because you're gonna change the context, and people will adapt to the context. But are you gonna really change their mind?
Hmm.
And the mind and the heart, of course, you can do something with inspiration, motivation for the heart. Maybe you can give education, training, coaching for the head, but it's only making a space that is able to receive. If the context doesn't shift, it's not going to receive anything. It's not going to go through. And indeed, maybe the route to that is the interpreted context, where you work with the context, and that gets you the progress. Am
Yeah,
I, am
so
I
if
reading that correctly, Manish?
yeah, I mean, another interesting thought came is mindset shift may have inertia towards the right, of course. And as we pull this interpreted context to the right, or somebody like coach pulls that context forcefully, it will create a tension, and this inertia will try to resist. But then it depends on how it is done, meaning how well it was changed or how impactful it was, maybe with disruption or whatever, with more data points, with more reality checks, with more simulations and other mechanisms, as Prasanna was saying. So shift in mindset will have inertia, and imagine it's like an elastic cord here. We are pulling, but it is gonna stretch. If you let go of that inertia, you will be pulled towards the right, and there would be the mindset shift. And again, by best we don't mean that best that is in the industry, but best that it can be. For example, we always say you need to be the best you can be to
Right.
realize your potential, right? So at least in that context, a coach can only unearth the best of the founder, I believe.
Tanuka, did you want to add something?
Shifting the mindset will mean shifting all those elements and working with all those elements. Yeah. Very good, very good.
Yeah,
I
like
can add.
Prasanna said, delegation, like action, right? So hands would be on the right, maybe saying he's very good at taking action, bias towards action. All those elements can pitch in. Yes.
Awesome. Tanuka, you wanted to add something?
No, this is very interesting actually. Um, this whole thing about shifting the interpreted context to the right. This is really because when Prasanna and I were chatting earlier about making this map, that part I really felt is very crucial. Of yeah, you
Tanuka, you're
just get
breaking up.
the inter yeah. Now is it
Tanuka,
better?
you're breaking up. Maybe you want to turn your video off.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just saying that as a coach, you really struggle to get the real version of reality from the founders that we speak with. So this part is something that's really interesting.
Cool. So, folks, anybody else have any questions or thoughts and you want to jump in, please do. We can have up to, I think, 9 people on this table. And so we have space for, I think, 4 or 5 more if we remove the map. But we're discussing the map. So,
And we're
feel free to
happy
jump.
to switch our seat as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here. So let me ask a different question then. What has been something that's challenging from a coaching perspective in terms of just habits, right? Because let's say that we spoke about mindset shifts quite. We said, there has to be an alignment between head and heart. There has to be some inspiration which might move the heart, and you might have to have some frameworks which move the head. But do you have any examples of what is required to make a uh, shift in the hands, right, in the doing? And Manish, please feel free to jump in as well, and we can try to see if we can map that.
Philip, you may go first if you wish.
If you have, I mean, I could share something. It's more an example, but if you have something you want to answer directly, you can go ahead, Manish. Do you have something you want to say?
Yeah, I'm just trying to see, like, because we had a bunch of discussion around the mindset,
Yeah,
around
yeah.
heart and head. I was just wondering, like, is there something that we can talk about from a hands perspective, or in terms of I'm looking at habits, or what's the metaphor there for changing the habits, right? Which is really the doing of things.
Yeah, I think action it could be attributed to this. For example, if we have a particular habit, we want to break it. We try to procrastinate it for as much long time as possible, right? We'll say, okay, we'll do it tomorrow. And then coach tells us, we have this habit, you have to change it. Maybe we'll try to shift that and we'll say, okay, we'll change it tomorrow, right? And so, bias towards action. So you want to learn swimming? Oh, I'll learn it tomorrow. Then one day you need to be pushed, or you take a resolution and jump into the water and take that action, right? So abrupt action, maybe, or take action is something that would break the habit. Like, do it instead of just saying I will do it tomorrow. or procrastinating. So that is something really ties up with habit, uh, and it really, for some, it really, I don't know how it happens to them, but for some it may take an event to happen, like a disruption, which Philip mentioned, like create a disruption that will force people to change the habit or act in the way that would be fruitful for them. Initially, they may not realize that this is right thing for them, but when they take that action and they get that outcome, it may give them incentive to continue. From my perspective,
Okay.
that's hands.
Okay. So what I heard was this: there should be some action that people take in order to change that habit, right? Would you say that taking the action, like why, it should be more tangible, right? Generally, if I want to learn something, the action to do it is actually more tangible than the habit itself. Is that fair?
Yes, and it may either require motivation or abrupt disruption, engineered disruption, maybe in some way.
Okay. In
For
that case,
some,
it'll be
a gentle motivation helps. For some, maybe a disruption helps.
oops, not this out of whack. Awesome. So we're almost out of time. We have 10 minutes left. Any other questions or any other thoughts that anybody else wants to
Philip,
talk about?
Philip is
I'm
showing
playing with the
something.
map here. Can you see it? Uh,
It's hard to read.
Oh, sorry. I'll pin your image. Yeah, it's very blurred.
Sorry. So I'm trying to think an habit is something that relies on beliefs and experience, probably built over decades. And that maybe even underpinned by some element of fear of your position in the organization, fear of loss, fear of missing out, a number of things like that that may anchor it that way. And not trusting potentially or whatever it is, and that's, I'm talking about negative ones here, something you're trying to change. And then the habit, the idea, the new habit here will need to be underpinned by some knowledge. So you need to have some knowledge of why are we doing something different, what's underpinning that, what is the logic, how does it connect to the rest. So that requires some education, and sometimes people just don't have time to get their head around it. So time to actually even put it there and progress it in something they're going to do, time becomes the inertia factor.
Understood.
But also sometimes they need to build that confidence. So how do you push them over the hedge to actually try it? And the interesting thing is sometimes they just do it, and all those things will align, and that becomes an enabling constraint in a way. You have created something, or you have done something that will have cascading consequences that are positive, and it was the way for you to make that step. Sometimes you'll have to build up, to do small experiments that will actually pave your way to it. But fundamentally, you also need to build that confidence at the bottom. And you need to have the motivation for the change. And that you need to find, because otherwise there's no motivation for it. So why would it happen? And very often, most people talk about at those levels, but they don't go at the level of motivation. So
So,
what is
Philip,
the motivation for the change? And that's
you
where
should
coaching actually goes deeper like that.
you should tweet this image, and I'll try to make it into a proper map with this tool, and we'll share that at the end of the session.
Cool.
So, folks, we have about 8 minutes. Is there anybody else who has any questions, or we can have a break, because I think we didn't have a break from the previous session as well? Holger or Christoph, do you folks want to come on, and do you want to share something? I think we've had a bunch of folks who have been listening and been quiet. I don't know whether there are any questions here or anybody else who wants to jump in and join the conversation or help us close the conversation. Going once, going twice, going thrice. All right, folks, thanks a lot for joining us
Thank
and
you.
helping us with this session. Thank you, Philippe. Thank you, Manish. And Tanuka, do you want to add anything?
Just one thing where Philippe was talking about small, small experiments and small ways to build a habit. So I just wanted to share that I don't like coming on stage and doing public speaking. I have a horror of public speaking. And on Sunday, Prasanna said, we have map camp and let's go talk about coaching. Will you come with me? I said, no. And then he said, will you come and talk for part of it? Right. So he broke it down and made a small thing. And I said, okay, I can manage that. And so, that's a master coach at work.
There
All
you
right.
go. New habits. Now you're going to be a specialist of that.
Exactly. She's going to be a great speaker. Thanks, Manish, again. Thanks,
Thank
Philippe,
you,
and thanks,
Prasanna.
Tanuka. See
Super,
you,
thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Flip. Bye.